Hi everybody, Micah here with EbikeSchool.com, and today I'm going to be showing you how to build an electric bicycle battery. Now I'm going to be building a very small 24 volt battery, but you can build any size battery you want of any capacity using the same methods I'm going to show you here, just by adding more cells in series or in parallel. So I'll start by showing you how I build these batteries, and I start by designing them here on paper. Now I start by drawing out my battery design on paper so that I make sure I've got it all planned out correctly and that it's going to go the way I want it to. Now the first thing I do is I draw all of my cells here. I like to take my first cell and just trace it to make sure I've got the approximate size, and then I just trace however many cells I'm going to use and put them in whatever layout I plan to use. This is just going to be a straight battery, so it's just going to be 7 cells in series and 2 in parallel. Next, what I do is I indicate which end is positive and which is negative. So here I've shaded all the positive ends of the cells and I've left the negative ends empty. So now I know when I'm setting up my battery, positive's dark, negative's light. And then I just label them so that I don't get this mixed up. You really don't want to get positive and negative mixed up when you're dealing with batteries. Now the next thing, I already started this, but I figured I'd wait and show you while I do it, is I draw where I'm going to put my nickel strips to connect these cells into the battery. Now the important thing here is we're wiring in both parallel and series. So parallel is when we're going to be wiring the same pole, in this case on the first set of cells, the positive poles together. And then on the opposite side, we're going to be doing the same thing, wiring the negative ends of the first cell together. Then we're going to be doing series connections, where we wire the positive of the first cell, +1, to the negative of the second group of cells, the -2. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to start with my first cell. This is the positive end, and I'm just going to wire these in parallel. I've already drawn a line here. The next two, the negative ends of the second cells, are also going to get drawn in parallel here. But then these two are going to be wired in series, so I'm also going to draw series connections here. That way we're going from +1 to -2. Next, we're going to skip from -2 to +3. This is going to be connected on the other side. And we're going to move right from +3 to -4. So we're going to do the parallel connections here, but we're also going to do series connections. Again, we're going to skip -4 to +5. That's going to be connected on the other side. And we're going to go straight from +5 to -6. So parallel connections, drawing is left-handed here, and series connections there. And then we're going to not wire in series from -6 to +7. We're just going to do parallel connection. Then on the other side, what I like to do is draw on both sides of the paper. And that way I can just flip this over in real life, and it'll be just like flipping my battery over to check. So now we've got the -1 here. I'm going to wire this in parallel. And then we're going to go from our -1, we're going to leave this not connected, because if you look on the other side, you can see +1 connects straight to -2. So we're going to skip this connection. This is why it's good to be able to flip the paper over and just double check here. So we're going to skip this connection and go straight to our +2, which is connected in parallel, and connected to our -3, which those were also connected in parallel there. Now we're going to skip from -3 to +4. It's already done on the other side. And we're going to connect these cells in parallel and then in series. And the same thing here. We're going to skip and go on to the next set of 2 cells, +6 to -7. And now this is going to give us a battery that is 2 sets of cells in parallel and then 7 sets of cells in series. And that's how I set up my batteries before I weld them. Now we've gotten to the cells. I'm going to use these Panasonic 18650 PF cells, but there are a lot of different types of cells out there you can use. In the description below I'll put links to a few of the different types that I commonly use, and it's just up to you to see which works best for your application. These cells can discharge at up to 10 amps per cell, so they're going to be good for my battery that I'm only going to have 2 cells in parallel. And this is going to go on a bike that has a 10 amp controller, so I should have a safety factor of about 2. Now the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to measure all these cells and make sure that they've got the exact same voltage. The next thing I do is just measure the voltage of each cell before I connect them in parallel to make sure that they're all the same. So I just come down here and I check each cell. 3.63, 0.63. They should all be within about 1 or 2 hundredths of a volt. 3.63. As long as they're all about the same, within a couple hundredths, you're good. Now I know that all my cells are at the exact same voltage and they're ready to be combined. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to start hot gluing my cells together. I like to use hot glue because it makes the smallest battery possible. Some people use these black snap together connectors as spacers and they align all the cells, and that works great too. It's just they take up a lot more room and they make a bigger battery. So I just use hot glue to hold my cells together, and it's worked great for dozens of batteries. Lots of people do it this way, but you can do it either way. I'll put links to those plastic spacers in the description so you can see if you want to do it that way. Now I'm just going to line up my cells the same way that I have them drawn here in my design drawing. So I'm just going to start lining these guys up. So this is going to be my first row of cells here. On top of that I'm going to put my next cells, but I'm going to do those one at a time using the hot glue. And now I've got my battery together largely in one block. But now that I've got a battery that's got positive and negatives on different ends, there's two very important things I'm going to do here. I'm going to remove any jewelry. I'm going to start wearing gloves. This is very important because you don't want to short circuit the terminals of your battery. We can also see now that my battery matches my drawing. Here I've got my negatives, this is -1 terminal, and everything follows according to my drawing. Now I can go ahead and start adding that nickel strip onto the batteries. Now when it comes to nickel, you want to use pure 100% nickel strip. You don't want to use nickel plated steel strips. They're cheaper, but they're going to give you a lot more resistance and the battery's going to heat up more. This is, or it used to be, a kilogram of 0.15 millimeter, 8 millimeter wide nickel strip, and this is 100% pure nickel. Now it's probably about a half a kilogram. I just built this little holder for it, but you can use whatever you want for it. And now I'm just going to cut these into strips using a pair of scissors. Now your nickel strips are going to need to be long enough to cover however many cells you have in parallel on your battery. On my battery here I've just got 2 cells in parallel, so I need enough nickel strip to cover 2 cells. It's about 4 centimeters or so, and about a little under 2 inches. I kind of play this by ear, but you can measure it out. I've just done so many of these that I know about how long I need to cut these. So you just need to cut however many you need. I'm going to need a pile, so I'm just going to cut a pile here. Alright, so here's where the welding comes in. Now I'm going to start on this first -1 cell here. So I'm going to do my first parallel here. I'll show you how I do that. Now I'm going to take my first piece of nickel strip and I'm going to very carefully lay it in place here. I'm going to do this very carefully. You don't want to miss and hit the wrong terminals. And now I'm going to bring this up to my welder probes. I've got this set on 40 amps and a double pulse. It's a setting I just always use for this size nickel, and this is the nickel I always use. I'm going to bring it up, make sure I've got good contact between the nickel strip and the probes. I'm just going to lift up on my welder here, and I put my first spot weld in. Now if I lift this up, you'll see that's welded on there. I can't get that off. And I can pry that off with pliers, but the point is it's well on there. I like to put 6 or 8 spots here, which means 3 or 4 welds. There's 8 contact points. Now I'm going to go across and complete the parallel weld here. I'm just going to put another 4 welds. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now you can see I've got this nickel strip paralleling these 2 cells here. Now, if we go back to our drawing here, it's the next thing we need on this side of the battery. We're going to do between +2 and -3 cells. So I'm going to bring this back over. I'm going to bring in my next piece of nickel strip, which is going to bridge the next 2 cells. I'm going to very carefully place this one. When you do the positive ends, they're a little trickier because they're a little bit smaller. And I'm going to weld this. I'm just going to do 3 welds here because it's a little smaller. There we go. I'll do the same thing here. Now you saw that spark on the first one. I actually missed the, if you look, I actually went a little far over to the left there and missed the cap. I want to try not to do that. I'm watching the camera while I'm doing this, and so it's a little tricky. You should really watch your workpiece, but you want to try to stay right on top of the end cap there. There we go. I'm just going to do one more from this way for good measure, because I missed that one weld there. There we go. So now I've got those guys paralleled, the second set of cells. I'm going to parallel the third set, and I'm going to weld those in series. So I'm going to do one more
here, very carefully placing your nickel. Weld that guy on. Okay, now I'm going to do my series welds. All right, so I'm going to connect the positive second cell to the negative end of the third cell. So I'm going to put these on very carefully. There we go. I'm going to weld that in place, and that's going to be our first series connection. Now you notice I'm welding on top of another strip here. That's perfectly fine. You want to make sure that your base strip is going to have a lot of really good welds. And if you can, I'm actually going to add another weld just over the edge here. It's a little hard to see there. So that that top strip of nickel is going to be also welded straight to the end cap of the battery cell. So there's another couple of welds there just to make sure that it's actually connected also to the battery and the piece of nickel strip under there. And then on the other side of the strip, I'm going to complete the series connection. Now again, this is tricky because you want to try to stay on the strip and on the end cap of the battery. I'll turn this a bit. There we go. I'm going to do one more here on the other side. And this is going to complete my series connections on the second set of cells. Make sure those nickel strips don't stick to your gloves and move around. You got to be real careful when you're doing this. Actually going to slide that strip over just a little bit. There we go. See, it looks like I missed the end cap just a little bit there. You want to be careful and try to get that as well as you can. A couple of miss welds aren't going to be an issue. If you try to weld over air, it's just going to put a little hole in the nickel, but you want to get as many good welds on there as you can. So I'm going to turn this way and get another couple of welds in. There we go. Now I've got my first set of series connections.
I forgot to mention this earlier, but I do wear my goggles when I'm doing welding. Every now and again you're going to get a few sparks that jump off, and you really don't want to catch one of those in the eye. These don't look cool, but I've still got both my eyes.
So now I've finished these last welds here that you can see. So we can go ahead and flip this over. Turn the page here. Easier said than done wearing gloves. Now we'll flip the battery in the same way. And now I've actually already started here with this first weld, and we're going to continue the welds following the diagram. So we're going to do these first two parallels in series. We're going to skip the series here because it's done on the other side. You can see out here between the second and third cell there, that's already seriesed. So we're actually going to skip it here, which is this break here. We're going to pick up with the next one. Now I've finished up all of my connections here. The last thing I'm going to do, and this is somewhat optional, I'm just going to go back and on top of every one of these series connections, I'm going to lay down an extra layer of nickel strip. This is just going to reduce the internal resistance of this battery and make the current flow that much easier. So I'm going to go ahead and just add these on top here, right on top of my existing series connections. And I'm just going to weld them right on there, piggyback style. And that's just going to make a better battery. So now I've got all of these series connections doubled up, and I'm ready to go ahead and solder on my BMS. So here I've got my BMS. This is a 7-cell BMS, and it's rated for 20 amps, which is about twice as much as I'm going to need. Here you can see where all the sense wires connect. Here we've got the sense wires. So these guys just go in like this. And we should have here 8 sense wires. So we're going to have one for each cell, and then the first cell is going to get both a positive and a negative. Just in there you can see it's got the B1, B2, B3, and it tells you each one of those is a positive except that first one. It's a little hard to see there. That first one is B negative. So just take my word for it. When you actually read this with your own eyes, it's a little hard to see with the lighting and the camera here. You'll be able to read those little numbers there, and that tells you where each one of these wires goes. Now on the BMS, we've got 3 pads we have to connect here. We've got B minus, P minus, makes it easier, and C minus. C minus is the charge connector. We're going to do that one first. So I'm going to solder up this charging connector here. This is just an RCA connector that I'm going to use for my female charge connector. So I'll start with the positive wire here. See, my soldering iron tip is about finished. Really need to get a new one here. Yeah, try to use a good soldering tip. It's going to make this a lot easier. Now I can take a little bit of heat shrink and just cover that connection there. Leave enough of the barrel exposed to make my next connection. Now I'm just going to use a piece of tape here to hold this in place. Alright, and there's C minus, the charge minus, connected to our charge connector there. Now, for the P minus here, I've got a Anderson connector on one end. This is going to go out to the discharge. And the other end, I'm going to send straight to the P minus pad here. And there we have it. Nice. Now the last pad we have here is this B minus pad, and that's going to go to the negative end of the battery, or the negative end of the first cell of the battery to be more specific. So I'm just going to solder on this wire here, and then we're going to connect it to the battery. On the battery itself, I like to just make sure I'm not going to get confused, so I like to write on here the actual cells. Now my BMS is going to go on the side of my battery just like this. But before I put it on, I'm going to take this little piece of black foam here that I've cut out. I'm just going to use that as extra insulation here, just for any extra vibrations that are going to be picked up. I'm going to lay that on there, and now I'm just going to hot glue this in place, just like this. Now that I've got the BMS glued in place, I can cut the B minus wire and solder it straight to the negative end of the battery. Now you'll notice when I solder on the battery itself, I'm going to do it on the nickel strips. I'm going to do it in between the battery cells. That way I can solder for as short a period as possible, and I can get it as far away from the cell as possible, because you don't want to be heating up the cells if you can avoid it. Now on the opposite side, I'm going to solder on the positive of the charging cable. I'm also going to solder on the positive of the discharge cable. I'll show you how I do that. I've taken and put an Anderson connector on the end of this discharge cable. On the other end, I've joined with this heat-resistant tape, and I'm going to solder these guys right onto the positive end of the 7th cell. That's the positive end of the entire battery. Now I can go ahead and add on my sense wires here. So I've got my sense wires, and I'm just going to need to check to make sure I'm putting each one on the exact correct cell. You don't want to mix these up. So if I look right at the beginning here, that first, it's really hard to read, so I'll just have to take my word for it. Down in there it says B1 minus on the very first one. So when I plug that in, that's going to be this black wire is going to go to B minus. That's going to be the same spot where we connected B minus here, and that's the negative of the first set of cells. And now I can follow the next wires. If I take, so that second wire is going to be B plus 1. The third wire is going to be B plus 2. So I'm going to take the third wire here. Need to come out to B plus 2. I'm going to solder and actually first tin these nickel strips. I'm going to tin them, remember, in between each set of cells. So now I can take the +2, and this is, remember these two cells here, this is +2, but they're connected to -3. So all 4 of these nickel strips here are the same, essentially the same part of the circuit, which is +2. So we're going to go straight into +2 here. So now we do the same thing here for +4 and +6. Now we finish this side of the battery. What I like to do is after I finish the entire side of the battery, I like to take this heat resistant tape and just go over the entire thing and just cover all of these contacts. That way I know I'm not going to have any problem with shorts while I'm working on the rest of this. Now we can work on the other side of the battery here. And we can go ahead and tin all of these spots at once here. So there's +1, here's +3, and lastly +7. I'm just going to cover all of these connections here. Okay, lastly, I like to just take all my wires here and just make them nice and neat, and using that same tape, just tape them down.
Now the next thing I like to do is to wrap my batteries in a layer of foam. This is just some craft foam. It's 2mm thick EVA foam. I get it from AliExpress. I'll put a link in the description with all the other parts I'm using here. And what I do is I just cut out for my battery an exact shape that's going to wrap around it.
So here you can see I just take the battery, I put it on the foam here, close to the edge, and I just cut out a shape here that's going to fit the battery. I like to leave a little bit of overlap at the edges so that the corners have the most protection. And then I just wrap my battery up. And I even just used the same heat-resistant tape that I've been using before. You can use electrical tape at this point. It doesn't have to be this tape. I just have it on hand.
I keep a pile of different size shrink wrap around because I build a lot of batteries, but you can buy this stuff by the meter, so you don't need these gigantic rolls like I have. Basically, you just need a size that's going to slip over your battery before it shrinks, and you want it to be less than twice the size of your battery because it's going to shrink 2 times.
Here's the smallest stuff I have. Let's see if it's going to fit this way. It looks like it's going to be tight. Yeah, I think it's going to work though. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this for the outer shell, but I'm actually going to use another piece first to go around the outside perimeter. And I'll show you how I'm going to do that. All right, I think this size is going to be perfect. Yeah, there we go. So that fits sideways. So I'm going to go around this way first. And what that's going to do is it's going to seal the ends of my battery. Because if I were to just start with this piece this way, I would have the open ends left. And that's not going to look very nice. And it's not going to be that well protected. So I'm going to start this way. What I found is that when you seal the battery this way around the perimeter, that the best size to cut it at is exactly 11 centimeters. And that's going to give you the exact right thickness to cover both sides of the battery and just wrap around just a little bit on each side, that way it holds it. So measure out 11 centimeters this way, and I'll show you how I heat shrink that. I'm going to cut an 11 centimeter wide strip. Alright, let's get shrinking. Now you can see that the heat shrink has just started to wrap around the edges here, so it's hugging the edges. Same thing here. The foam here is actually a little wide. The battery goes in a lot more narrow than this, but the heat shrink is actually coming around the edge here, which is what you want. If it doesn't come around the edge like this, it's just going to slide off to one side. So now we can go ahead and we can put a long piece on. So we can measure this one out, just like this. And I like to add about 10 or 20% for shrinkage, because it'll shrink in this long direction as well. Most of the heat shrink action is going to be coming this way, where it's about 2 times shrinkage, but it'll still do about 10% along the long axis. So you got to keep that in mind. So I'm going to cut it about about here. We might have a little extra, but I think that'll be good. The other thing is I'm actually using a hair dryer here. This is my wife's hair dryer. My heat gun is actually really strong, and if I don't have it on one of the lowest settings, it'll overheat this stuff and it'll start to melt. So I found that just a good strong hair dryer is enough, and even sometimes better for doing this heat shrink. That might still be a little much. Let's go ahead and shrink it. If I need to, I can cut more off. You can't add more. Alright, I definitely went a little long here. One thing you can do is when it's hot, you can press it down and then just fold it over very nicely. I could have cut this a little shorter, but you know, it doesn't really bother me when it's a little bit long like that. And if anything, it just gives it a little more protection. If you leave it open, it's just that much more open to a little bit of water or moisture getting in if you're ever in the rain. So I like to try to have it as close as possible. Here, this is actually sticking out a little bit. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna heat it up again and just push this down here. So now as it cools, if I hold that, there we go. It's just cooling nice and flat now. Before it was sticking out all funny. So you can kind of, you know, mold and shape and sculpt your heat shrink.
And that's it. We finished our battery. Here we've got a 24 volt, 5.8 amp hour battery. It's a little guy, but it's going to be good for a small, low powered e-bike. And if you want to build a bigger battery, all you have to do is add more cells. More cells in series is going to get you a higher voltage, and more in parallel is going to give you more capacity. And it's that simple. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like to learn more about e-bikes, check out my website, EbikeSchool.com, where I've got all sorts of free articles about building e-bikes, making batteries, riding e-bikes. Anything you want to know about e-bikes, you can check it out there. Thanks for stopping by, and I hope you enjoyed the video.